Everyone called the bull cursed and dangerous, but a foster kid, who knew what it felt like to be misunderstood, saw something entirely different in its eyes. What happens next will leave you speechless. Rain slicked the wooden rails of the pen, the drops pattering softly against the mud below. Caleb Harlow's sneakers sank slightly into the wet earth as he stood there, breath rising in quick clouds in the cool night air. The only light came from the farmhouse porch, a faint yellow glow far behind him, and the pale silver wash of the moon that hung over Redhaven's rolling fields. In front of him, framed in the shadows of the old wooden pen, stood the bull. The animal was enormous, its shoulders broad and high, its black hide shining wet under the drizzle. One jagged horn curved upward like a blade, and deep scars cut across its face, pale against the dark fur. The bull didn't move, didn't stamp its feet or toss its head. It simply stared at him, unmoving, its breath coming in slow, steady bursts that clouded the air between them. Caleb gripped the top rail, his fingers cold and damp from the rain. He had only been on the ranch for a few hours, but the moment he'd first seen the bull, something had caught in his chest. Earlier that day, Vernon Pike, the man who now served as both his foster guardian and his employer, had walked him through the pasture, boots crunching on gravel. Vernon had spoken little, but when they passed this particular pen, his voice had hardened. "That's Ashram," he'd said. "Cursed. Killed 2 men who tried to tame him." Vernon's weathered face had carried no trace of exaggeration. To him, the danger was fact. Most would have walked away after hearing that. Caleb, however, couldn't. Now, hours later, with Vernon asleep in the farmhouse, Caleb had slipped quietly out the back door. The rain masked the sound of his footsteps as he crossed the pasture. He had expected the bull to snort or stomp in warning, but Ashram's eyes had fixed on him instead. Steady, unblinking, almost calculating. Caleb felt his heart thudding harder, not from fear, but from a strange recognition, as though the animal were measuring him the way Vernon had earlier that day. He leaned a little closer, resting his forearms on the top rail. The scent of damp hay and wet earth rose around him. "You're not cursed, are you?" he whispered, his voice barely carrying past the rain. It wasn't really a question for an answer, more a thought spoken aloud. The bull's ears twitched slightly, but there was no aggressive flare of nostrils, no flash of teeth. Instead, Ashram blinked slowly, his massive chest expanding and contracting as though breathing in Caleb's words. Caleb's mind drifted to the stories he'd overheard in town when he'd first arrived. Men in the diner speaking in low voices about the killer bull, about how it was bad luck to even stand near its pen. They told tales of how its eyes glowed red when angered, how it could break a man's spine in a single charge. But here, in the quiet rain, Caleb saw none of that. There was no rage in those eyes, only something watchful, something patient. He inched his hand forward, the rain cold on his skin, his fingertips brushing the slick wood of the rail. The distance between them felt like a test. If the bull lunged, he wouldn't have time to react, but the risk felt worth it. His breathing slowed as his hand hovered above the top beam, just a few inches from the gap. A sharp crack split the quiet. Caleb's head jerked toward the sound. Somewhere behind him, a twig had snapped. His pulse spiked instantly. He turned and saw a shadow detach itself from the darker line of the barn. A tall figure stepped into the dim light, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. It was Darrell Sykes, Vernon's eldest farmhand. Darrell stopped a few paces away, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. His hands rested easily on his hips, but his expression was anything but relaxed. The corner of his mouth tugged upward in a smirk, though his eyes carried no humor. "You'll regret getting close to that thing," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly over the rain. Caleb straightened slowly, unwilling to give ground yet aware that Darrell's gaze was as sharp as the jagged horn behind him. The older man's tone didn't feel like a casual warning. It was deliberate, pointed. His eyes shifted briefly toward Ashram, then back to Caleb, and there was something in that look Caleb couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even dislike. It was closer to possession, like someone speaking about property they didn't intend to share. "The curse gets everyone in the end," Darrell added, his smirk fading into something flatter, colder. The way he said it wasn't the way men told campfire legends. It was the way someone recited a fact, a certainty. Caleb swallowed, the rain rolling down the back of his neck. The bull stood silent behind him, but Caleb suddenly felt as though the danger in this moment didn't come from the animal at all. It stood between him and the man in the shadows, a silent presence, watching. Darrell lingered a moment longer, as if making sure his words had landed, before turning and walking back toward the barn, his silhouette melting into the rain and darkness. Caleb remained at the pen, fingers curling tightly around the rail. He could still feel Ashram's eyes on him, steady and unblinking, as though the bull had heard every word. "You'll regret getting close to that thing," Darrell muttered, The curse gets everyone in the end. The hammer in Caleb's hand struck the post with a dull thud, sending a faint tremor through the wood. He was kneeling near the far fence line, repairing a section that leaned dangerously close to collapse. The sun was low in the sky, spilling a pale gold light over the pasture, and from where he worked, he could see the shadowed shape of Ashram moving slowly in his pen. Caleb had been on the ranch long enough to notice something peculiar. Every ranch hand worked the fields, the barn, and the stables, but no one ever went near Ashram's enclosure. Not Darrell, not the two other hired men, not even Vernon unless he had to. They skirted it like an invisible boundary had been drawn in the grass. Caleb didn't understand it, not fully, but he was beginning to notice patterns. The bull's gait was slightly uneven, like he carried an old injury that never fully healed. The scars that marked his flanks and shoulders weren't jagged like the results of a fight. They were clean, straight, almost like lash marks. And every time Darrell passed by the pen, Ashram would tense, pulling back from the fence with his ears pressed flat against his head. Caleb paused in his work, resting his weight against the post as his eyes drifted toward the bull. Ashram stood still, head slightly lowered, watching him in that same steady way he had on the night they first saw each other. Caleb's grip tightened on the hammer. Against his better judgment, and against Vernon's orders, he stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. He took a slow step toward the pen, then another. The air between them felt heavy, the quiet broken only by the faint rustle of the grass in the breeze. Caleb kept his voice low and even. "Easy now," he murmured, the way he imagined someone might talk to a skittish horse. He moved until he was just at the rail, his fingers curling over the top beam. Ashram's head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as he leaned forward, his breath warm against the cool air. Caleb held his ground, heart thudding steadily. The bull's massive nose edged closer, close enough that Caleb could smell the faint scent of hay on his breath. The moment felt fragile, like a thread pulled taut. Caleb's hand shifted, palm open, just an inch from contact. A shadow cut across the sunlight. Darrell's heavy boots squelched in the dirt as he approached fast, the smell of dust and sweat trailing him. Without a word, he shoved Caleb back, hard enough that his heel caught on the uneven ground. "You deaf, boy?" Darrell's voice was sharp, each word clipped. "Stay away." Caleb steadied himself, anger flashing across his face, but Darrell's glare pinned him where he stood. Ashram had pulled back toward the center of the pen, ears flat, muscles tight under his hide. Caleb glanced at him, then back to Darrell, and in that look he saw something colder than caution. Darrell's reaction wasn't just fear, it was possession, maybe even control, as if he had a stake in keeping Caleb away from the bull. That night, the sound of murmured voices pulled Caleb from the edge of sleep. He sat up in his small room, the dim light from the kitchen spilling faintly down the hall. Barefoot, he padded toward the sound, stopping just before the doorway. "Man from Brenton County," Vernon was saying, his voice low but tense. "Offered to buy Ashram. Big price." Darrell's tone was impatient, almost urgent. "Then take it. Before that bull hurts someone else. You keep him here, you're asking for trouble." "It's not that simple," Vernon muttered. "That animal's been with me longer than you've been working here." Darrell's reply came faster with an edge. "Animals like that don't change, and one day you're going to wish you'd listened to me." Caleb eased back into the shadows, heart beating hard. There was something in Darrell's voice, too sharp, too eager, that twisted in his gut. He didn't know why, but it made him uneasy. The next day, the ranch's steady rhythm broke. Caleb was hauling water from the pump when a deep bellow split the air. It was the kind of sound that carried, low, raw, and filled with power. He dropped the bucket and ran, the grass whipping at his legs as he crossed the field toward Ashram's pen. The gate was wide open. Darrell was inside, backed against the far fence, a cattle prod gripped in his right hand. Ashram stood just a few paces away, pawing the ground, his head low. The dirt under his hooves kicked up in small clouds. Caleb's breath came quick, but even in the tension, he noticed something. Ashram wasn't charging. He was holding his ground, snorting in short bursts, like he was challenging Darrell to make the first move. Darrell's eyes darted toward the gate, calculating the distance. His knuckles whitened around the prod, electricity crackling faintly at its tip. Without thinking, Caleb vaulted the fence. His boots hit the dirt inside the pen with a thud, and he planted himself between the bull and the older man. "Don't!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the rush of adrenaline. Darrell's face twisted. "Get out of the way!" But Caleb didn't move. He held his arms slightly out, not toward Darrell, not toward Ashram, just enough to block the path between them. Behind him, the bull's breathing was steady, not panicked. Caleb could almost feel the heat radiating from the animal's body. A beam of light swept over them. Vernon strode into the pen, his flashlight cutting across the scene. "What in blazes is going on?" he barked. Daryl's voice shifted instantly, dripping with accusation. "The kid let him out. I caught him in here, riling the bull up. He could have gotten us both killed." "That's not," Caleb started, but the weight of Vernon's eyes silenced him. He knew the man trusted Daryl more than him, and any protest would only make him look defensive. Ashram shifted behind him, the ground vibrating faintly under his step. Caleb turned his head slightly, meeting the bull's gaze in the darkness. The look wasn't wild or frightened, it was steady, almost deliberate. Vernon gave a sharp command, and Ashram moved toward the open gate, calm as if nothing had happened. Caleb stepped aside, watching as Vernon led the bull back into the pen. But just before the gate closed, Ashram turned his head, his dark eyes locking on Caleb's. It wasn't a glance, it was something else, something that felt like understanding. And in that silent exchange, Caleb felt it settle between them. It was a pact, one neither of them could break. The rain was already coming down in sheets when Caleb eased the latch on the back door and stepped onto the porch. The boards were slick beneath his socks, and the cold night air carried the heavy scent of wet earth. Somewhere out in the dark, thunder rolled low over the hills, its echo rumbling through his chest. He had been lying in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rising wind rattle the loose tin on the barn roof. Then he'd heard them, boots crossing the porch. A pause, the faint creak of the barn door. Caleb moved quickly now, slipping down into the yard, the mud cold and sucking at his feet as he cut across the open stretch toward Ashram's pen. Every step splashed water up his legs, but the storm swallowed the sound. In the pen ahead, a massive shadow shifted. The bull's head lifted, ears flicking toward him, as if he recognized Caleb even in the chaos of the weather. The thought of Daryl's voice from earlier that evening pushed Caleb forward. He could still hear it in his mind, low and certain, the words from behind the half-finished corral fence. "We'll do it during the storm. No one will question it. Just say the bull got spooked and trampled him." It had been enough to make Caleb's stomach knot, the meaning settling over him like ice. Daryl wasn't talking about putting down the bull, he was talking about killing him. He reached the gate and grabbed the cold, wet latch. The wind whipped his hair across his eyes, but he didn't hesitate. With a sharp lift, the latch slid free, and the gate creaked open. Ashram stepped forward without rushing, his massive shoulders rising and falling in the dim light as if he sensed what was about to happen. Caleb stepped back, his breathing ragged, the mud sucking at his boots as he gave the animal room. A figure emerged from the barn. The flash of lightning lit Daryl's face for an instant, rain streaking his skin, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on Caleb with a flat, almost businesslike expression. In his hands he held a long crowbar, the metal slick with water, catching the faintest glint from the lightning above. "You shouldn't have meddled, kid," Daryl called over the wind. His voice was steady, almost calm, but the way his grip tightened on the crowbar betrayed a readiness for violence. Caleb's back hit the fence line. He swallowed, forcing his voice to stay even, though his pulse thundered in his ears. "You don't have to do this." Daryl stepped closer, boots squelching in the mud, the crowbar hanging just low enough to be swung at a moment's notice. "It's already done," he said, his tone final. Another flash tore the sky open, bathing the pen in pale white for a split second. In that instant, Ashram lunged, not at Caleb, but past him, a black wall of muscle and force. The ground shook under the bull's charge as his massive head and shoulders slammed into Daryl's chest, driving him backward into the mud. The crowbar flew from Daryl's hands, landing with a dull thud just a few feet from Caleb. Daryl's breath left him in a harsh grunt as he hit the ground. Caleb's own lungs burned as he scrambled for the crowbar, fingers closing around the wet metal. He spun back, ready to swing if Ashram turned his aggression toward him. But Ashram didn't move toward Caleb. The bull stood over Daryl, sides heaving, breath blasting from his nostrils in hot bursts against the cool rain. His front hooves shifted slightly, sending water and mud splashing as if daring Daryl to try standing. "Get back!" Caleb shouted, his voice breaking in the wind, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for Daryl or for the bull. Daryl's eyes darted between the animal towering over him and Caleb gripping the crowbar. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, the fight drained out of him as quickly as the air had been knocked from his chest. Caleb's mind raced. The storm roared louder, the thunder chasing itself across the hills, and he knew no one could hear him calling from here. He still yelled for Vernon, his voice hoarse and raw against the downpour. "Vernon, over here!" The seconds stretched, each one a thread pulled tighter, until finally a beam of light cut through the curtain of rain. Vernon's figure emerged from the dark, the flashlight in his hand bouncing over the scene. Caleb standing, soaked through and shaking, Ashram looming calm and still beside him, and Daryl lying flat in the mud. Vernon stopped at the edge of the pen, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. His eyes moved from Darrell to Caleb, then to Ashram, lingering on the bull's steady posture. Caleb braced himself for the lecture, the accusation, the weight of Vernon's doubt. He had expected the old man to believe Darrell's version of the story. He always did. But this time, Vernon's eyes narrowed in a way that made Caleb's breath catch. It wasn't the look of a man convinced. It was something else, something closer to suspicion. For the first time, the old man's eyes showed doubt. Vernon's voice cut through the quiet of the barn the next morning. "Tell me exactly what happened." He stood in the aisle between the stalls, arms crossed, his weathered face set in the same unreadable expression he had worn the night before. Caleb shifted on his feet, glancing toward the far end where Ashram stood in his pen, head bent over the hay rack. "I told you," Caleb said carefully, keeping his voice steady. "Darrell came out here during the storm. He wasn't after Ashram. He was after me." Vernon's eyes narrowed, studying him. "That's a serious thing to say about a man who's worked here for years." Caleb swallowed. "I heard him on the phone earlier that day. He was planning it. Said he'd make it look like the bull trampled me." The barn seemed to absorb the silence that followed. Outside, a few early crows called over the pasture. Vernon finally exhaled through his nose, slow and heavy. "And the bull?" "He didn't touch me," Caleb said. "He went for Darrell." Something flickered across Vernon's face. Uncertainty, maybe even doubt in the man he'd trusted. He glanced toward Ashram's pen again, the bull lifting his head briefly as if aware he was the topic. Over the next few days, Vernon asked more questions, sometimes in passing, sometimes sitting with Caleb in the kitchen late in the evening. At first, Caleb thought the old man was trying to catch him in a lie, but gradually he realized Vernon was piecing things together. Bits of the bull's past came out. Darrell had been responsible for handling Ashram after his last owner's death. The scars on Ashram's hide had not come from other bulls. They were from a whip. A week later, Darrell was gone. No confrontation, no shouting, just a quiet word from Vernon in the morning, and by sundown Darrell's truck was gone from the drive. For Caleb, survival wasn't enough. Every time he saw Ashram in the pen, calm and still, he thought about the whispers in town, the way even the ranch hands gave him a wide berth. He wanted to change that. More than that, he wanted to prove it wrong. It started with small things. Caleb brought fresh hay to the pen himself, speaking softly as he worked. At night, when the house was still, he'd slip outside with a brush, working the dust and mud from the bull's coat. Ashram didn't trust easily, but the guarded stiffness in his stance began to fade. One night, the bull even leaned slightly into the brushstrokes, his breathing slow and steady. Days turned into weeks. Caleb began working on voice commands, pairing them with light touches on the rail or the sound of a snap. "Back," he'd say, and Ashram would take a slow step away. "Come," and the bull would shift forward, stopping at the exact spot Caleb marked. It was patient, deliberate work, and more than once Caleb thought it might fail. But each success built on the last. Vernon noticed. At first he only watched from a distance, arms folded, making no comment. But one afternoon, as Caleb guided Ashram in a circle around the pen with nothing more than a raised hand, Vernon's mouth twitched into something like a smile. "You keep this up," he said, "and you might just make people eat their words." The real test came when the county livestock showcase was announced. Vernon had no intention of taking Ashram. Too risky, he said. The bull's reputation alone would draw trouble. But Caleb pressed. "Let them see," he said. "Not the stories, not the scars, the real Ashram." It took 3 days to convince him. Vernon finally relented with a gruff, "You're responsible for him. If he so much as snorts wrong at someone, we're loading back up." The morning of the showcase was bright and cool, the field behind the fairgrounds dotted with trailers and stock pens. Caleb could feel eyes on them as they unloaded. Whispers rippled through the crowd when Ashram stepped down the ramp, black hide gleaming, scars stark in the sunlight. A few men stepped back, muttering about the curse. Caleb ignored them. He led Ashram into the arena, the bull's halter rope loose in his hand. They started simple, straight lines, stops on command. Then tighter maneuvers, a slow turn, a pause at a single word. The arena was quiet except for the steady rhythm of Ashram's breathing and Caleb's calm, even voice. Not once did Ashram buck or shy away. He followed each cue with deliberate precision, his massive head dipping slightly in what almost looked like acknowledgement. When Caleb gave the final command and Ashram stopped squarely in place, there was a long, heavy pause. Then the silence broke into applause, hesitant at first, then growing. Caleb saw faces that had been wary now leaning forward, expressions shifting from fear to something closer to respect. By the end, the judge pinned the blue ribbon to Ashram's lead rope. Vernon, standing at the gate, reached out and clasped Caleb's shoulder firmly. "Guess you were right, boy," he said, his voice carrying both surprise and pride. That night, the ranch was quiet again. Caleb walked out to the pen, leaning against the rail as Ashram chewed lazily under the stars. The bull's sides rose and fell in a slow rhythm, the warm scent of hay hanging in the cool air. "We did it," Caleb whispered. Ashram blinked slowly, the same unhurried, knowing look he'd given Caleb that first night. The curse was gone, not because it had been broken, but because it had never been real. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores powerful themes of empathy, overcoming prejudice, and finding unexpected connections. This narrative aims to challenge assumptions, highlight the resilience of both humans and animals, and inspire compassion for those who are often dismissed or misunderstood.